record. Before we get started into our reading of communications, we're going to have Mr. LeCicero talk about with the Frank Soll and Mark Haverstock for the amateur radio little presentation or something. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, that was essentially my introduction.
Oh,
You just gave. About, I don't know how long ago it was, but you guys had a demonstration the service you provide, really the country and the nation. And I happened to be the mayor, and I was so impressed with what you guys do for us, and I was so unaware that I thought that this might be a good forum for you to tell us, and it is also recorded, explain something about your organization and what it is you do for us. I think it would be beneficial for all of us to know more about what you do. And as President of Council said, is Mark Haverstock and Frank Soll are going to make a brief presentation for us. So please, we're all ears.
All ears. So are you standing in front of the camera here?
No, the podium. You'll get the back of your head.
Back of my head. Okay. And I'm covered with old stuff. All right. As he was mentioning, we did what we call Field Day, which is an exercise that we do, emergency preparation, once a year at the end of June. We did that at the Mill Creek Park, well, it used to be called the Experimental Farm. Metro Park Farm now. And we spent a weekend out there essentially setting up equipment, making contacts with other amateur radio operators, and working on emergency power in the event that we would have some kind of a natural disaster. We've had that practice, we're prepared. And Frank and I are going to kind of split things up real quickly here. I'll give you a little background and history about amateur radio. Actually, it dates back to the early days of radio back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, back in the day of Marconi and Hertz and Tesla. And also just ordinary people who were interested in radio began experimenting. And early experimenting began probably about 1904 with the general population. There were thousands of people playing with radio by 1910. By the time World War I and World War II came along, we had some restrictions. We couldn't operate. But there was this pool of people who were trained in using radios, and a lot of them enlisted in the armed forces. And so that's one benefit from this development of radio at the time. And we had, I guess, three major times of growth. The first one was between World War I and World War II. Radios were in practically every home in the United States. It was a primary form of entertainment. And also radio parts were inexpensive, so people could go out and buy the parts and build their own radios. There was more growth after World War II, particularly from Army surplus or military surplus equipment coming on the market and being available after the war. And amateur radios operators would pick these things up and convert them over so they could be used with on the amateur radio bands. Commercial equipment was developed during that time, the 1950s and 1960s, but a lot of us don't prefer to build our own equipment, or at least partially that. Currently, there are more than 800,000 licensed amateur radio operators in the United States. Worldwide, there are about 2.7 million. The country with the next biggest population of hands is Japan. They have about 450,000 operators licensed there.
The technology part of ham radio obviously has been around since the birth of radio. As ham radio operators, we, as Mark mentioned, we were some of the first experimenters with the original radio. In fact, Warren P. Williamson, who started WKBN broadcasting here in Youngstown, was an amateur radio, and so was the fellow that assisted him in starting that broadcasting operation. So there was kind of a division between the amateur part and the people that made money off of radio at that point, okay, in the early 1900s. Mr. Williamson chose the money branch, which was fine. But the technology part of radio development obviously continued in the early 1900s. During the wars, as Mark mentioned, a lot of us enlisted. During World War II, we helped develop radar, we helped develop the coding system, In fact, some of the early computer systems that nobody really knows about today, in fact, they're just starting to find out because from World War II, it had just been declassified. And a lot of our people were working on the early computers that were developed mainly to figure out trajectories and things like that. Single sideband radio, FM radio, all of those things were, if not invented, they were perfected by amateur radio operators. Long-distance communications. General Curtis LeMay was an amateur radio. By the way, we've got a list of amateur radio operators that were famous, and the list goes on for pages. Curtis LeMay was one of them, and he encouraged the military to adopt single sideband after his using it as an amateur, realizing the benefits of using it. So a lot of the technology development has gone on through the years, and it still goes on. Right now, we've figured out how to connect computers, these things that we're all using today, even our cell phones, to radios to do things that are absolutely amazing. We can actually talk to each other today when you can't even hear a signal. It just sounds like noise, but the computers can hear the signal, and they actually make the connection, and we're talking to each other and transferring information. So the technology development still continues today. We've got people on the International Space Station. They're everywhere, doing neat things with technology. And one of the things that we do an awful lot with is weather, Skywarner. I'll let Mark talk about that.
Okay, one of the public service things that we participate in is called Skywarn. It's a program from the National Weather Service. It was developed in the 60s to train spotters. Now, you don't have to be an amateur radio operator to be involved in Skywarn, but a lot of us are. And basically we provide reports of hazardous weather, and we're kind of the eyes and the ears for the National Weather Service. In our case, it would be the Cleveland, Ohio office. And what we do is we get together on the air. We have one person conduct what we call a network. In other words, we have all the amateur radio operators that happen to be available at that time. One person kind of directs this group, and we report in if we see things like heavy rainfall, flooding, hail, things like cloud rotation that might possibly turn into a tornado. And of course we cooperate too with local agencies as well, things like down trees, power lines. We report those to the appropriate people. We're required to have training for this. You just don't step in there and you know, you have to have some idea what you're doing. We have training every 2 years that we're required to maintain our certification. Generally, Skywarn observers work from home, but sometimes we're deployed to certain areas where there isn't somebody that can see what's going on. And I want to emphasize the fact we're not storm chasers, okay? Personal safety, of course, is a priority for us, but the idea is we're the observers, we're the people on the ground looking, passing that information on to the Cleveland National Weather Service, and from there they can issue warnings and watches as appropriate.
And the Cleveland Weather Service actually has an amateur radio station at the Weather Service in Cleveland that during bad weather times, they actually have that staffed by a licensed operator. And we're talking directly. So when you listen to an amateur radio net, as Mark said, a Skywarn net, you're hearing it firsthand what's going to the Weather Service. And that's just one of the public service things that we do for our community. And by the way, it's not just in this community. This is nationwide. It happens everywhere. We have our licenses are free. What we do is free, and a lot of that is we give back to the communities that we're in. The thing that Joe's came to and the mayor have been to, our field day operations, we're open to the public. We want people to see what we're doing. An awful lot of the races that you see going on, walkathons, you'll see somebody with a radio. We're providing public service communication for people in our community on a regular basis. But one of the things you don't see, as Mark just mentioned, is this preparation. We prepare for the big one, the bad things that happen. And amateur radio emergency services is what this is about. I'm involved with that too, so is Mark. It's done by county. And in Mahoning County, we have an ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Service. And we prepare and we train for disasters, not just weather-related disasters, but even something as simple as the water problem that they had down in Sebring. We actually had some folks down there helping out with that. Now, that wasn't as much of a communications need, but disasters almost always need communications. Case in point, Harvey and Irma just lately. You could actually listen to the amateur radio traffic. We now have it linked through the internet, so you can hear it in Youngstown, what's going on in Florida, what's going on in Texas. And we were actually listening to that, and the invaluable support that amateur radio provides. I mean, our police services, our fire services, they all have communication, but the amateurs provide that additional communications. It's absolutely vital when those networks get overloaded in times like these big disasters. All of our regular communications is sized for day to day. We take care of that stuff that isn't planned for in the big disaster. And if you listen in on those things, it's everything from saving lives to getting food to the right places and things like that. Those are the things that we plan for, train for on a regular basis. And we're kind of like the Minutemen in communication. You know, we come out of the woods when we're needed, and we provide that communications, and then when we're not needed, we go back to our daily jobs just like everybody else. And we're open to answering questions. We know we didn't have a lot of time. We could go on for a good while about this process.
I just want to, I personally want to thank you guys for sharing this.
No
and
problem.
It's nice to know that we have 800,000 guys and gals like you that are looking out for us, and with no pay, basically.
No, and by the way, there's no tax dollars involved.
Yeah.
We have a communication system that covers the entire county, okay? Numerous ways that we can cover the entire county, both with voice and digital, and no tax dollars are paying for that. We provide that ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the input.
Presentation.
I don't know if you made the point, and I didn't hear it, but you generate your own power. If the whole grid goes down, you're the only game in town.
Yeah, we, as Joe said, the exercise, and the mayor's been at our field day exercise, that entire exercise, all the radios, antennas, everything, all the communications here is run off our generator. In fact, this year I had a solar array out there that we made some contacts off of solar power. Our big thing is get off the grid, bad things, because when bad things happen, the electric goes down, the communications goes down, that's when we do our best work.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the input. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
How can we listen? You said we can listen in on over the computer?
Some are over the computer if you know how to get into different voice over IP networks, okay? But even a simple scanner that you can buy at Radio Shack, you can listen in on a lot of our local communication. Now, the longer distance communication, then you need like a shortwave radio. But even a decent shortwave radio, you can listen in on global communication. Yeah. Now, that communications vary depending on the time of day, solar cycles, things like that. Those are things we know, okay? General public doesn't normally know. But we're always happy to educate the general public, even the people that just want to listen in.
I am Skylar Roger.
Okay.
Do you guys ever think about, this has been a problem in my neighborhood many times, do you ever think about when you buy those big pitchforks in the sky to put in the air, which you do to other people's cell phones and other things? Every time someone new in our neighborhood gets a new one in our neighborhood, we have no cell phone services, keeps kicking in until they get it right.
I don't understand your question.
When you get the new, you know, you guys like to buy these big antennas and put them in your yard?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. And, you know, every time my neighbor gets a new one, we're all messed up with our cell phone service for a while.
There should be no, the frequencies and the modes that cell phones use should not be impacted whatsoever by amateur radio. Now, what you think is amateur radio might be CB. CB is a whole different world. And as I mentioned to the mayor, sometimes they can be dirty and interfere with things they're not supposed to interfere with. But amateur radio, we make sure our stuff does not interfere. And if there's someone in your neighborhood that is an amateur radio, and a ham radio operator, and they are interfering, if you tell them, it's on them to stop that interference. If they're amateur radio, they'll fix it. If they're CB, maybe not.
Mark, you guys are willing to hang out?
Yeah, if you want to hang out there.
Well, we don't want to hold you up.
maybe there's, if there are other questions, if you guys, can you guys hang out a while?
Sure.
Then after the meeting, it'll
That's fine.
quick.
Be happy
Maybe
to.
you could answer more
Sure.
questions. Thank you.